We were drifting in space with the control engines shut down and all of the instrumentations off, when suddenly an object appeared in the window. James McDivitt, commander of the Gemini 4 spacecraft. Now, obviously, the three of us weren't going to blur out, "Hey Houston, we've got something moving alongside of us and we don't know what it is." You know, Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11.
Boy, that sure is weird music. No. It's a whistling, you know, like an outer space type thing.
Apollo 10 crew. And this is a photograph of an unidentified object near the moon taken by the crew of Apollo 16. In the age of the internet and now AI, it is easy to think that everything I've just shown is simply fake. And indeed, there are quite a few such fakes. But these specific astronaut quotes, communication transcripts, and the photograph are real. And these are far from the only cases in which people in space have observed and photographed unidentified objects or phenomena. And ufologists actively use such accounts as evidence that we are being visited by aliens. And without context or analysis, such quotes or footage really do look strange. And they are given particular weight, of course, by the fact that these are not stories from random people on the internet, but from professionals who have actually been in space. It would seem unnecessary to create fakes when there are already plenty of strange accounts. But in a topic like this, it is impossible to avoid fakes and myths. Today we'll talk about both true and not so true cases in which astronauts have seen unidentified objects in space, whether in near-Earth orbit, near the moon, or even on the moon itself. Let's take a look at which accounts are genuine, and of course we'll figure out what they actually saw or heard. I'm Andrei, and this is Cosmos Elementary. In fact, in some media outlets and on the internet, you can come across various stories on this topic. That astronauts on the surface of the moon saw alien figures, or even crazier stories. There's really nothing to argue about here. However, there are indeed quite a few strange and fascinating accounts from people who have been to space, and various fabrications often grow out of real stories as well. The hype around UFOs on Earth, which have been rebranded as UAPs lately, has grown in recent years, especially after the release of the videos filmed by fighter jet pilots. And where these videos came from is also important. After all, there are lots of videos or photos of terrible quality with blurry spots taken by who knows whom. But here, the authenticity of the videos seems to have been confirmed by officials, and they were filmed by professionals. Although, there too the quality was certainly far from ideal, and simple explanations were also found for them. And today's story is similar in that respect. Here the witnesses aren't just some random Joes, but cosmonauts and astronauts, people who have been where most of us can't yet go. People began noticing strange and seemingly inexplicable things in space almost as soon as they started flying into space. And probably for the first flights, this was quite expected. After all, people found themselves in completely new and uncharted conditions. Who knows what could have been there that we didn't even suspect? And it definitely doesn't have to be aliens. But interestingly, such observations didn't stop, and they continued in the following decades, and have even occurred recently. I also have some examples today related, say, to the International Space Station. But let's go in order. Less than a year after the first flight of Yuri Gagarin, in February 1962, on the fifth manned space mission in history, Mercury Atlas 6, astronaut John Glenn went into space. This was the first orbital flight for the US, and during the flight, John Glenn suddenly reported that outside the window in space, he could see little fireflies, strange bright spots gathering near the spacecraft Friendship 7. It really does sound strange, maybe even frightening. What would you think in a situation like that? The mission's team first thought wasn't that these were alien microprobes, but that they were small ice crystals from the hydrogen peroxide thrusters used to orient the spacecraft. The crystals reflected sunlight and created this effect. However, Glenn, observing these fireflies, couldn't establish a connection between them and the operation of the thrusters. The true nature of these lights couldn't be determined right away, and they were observed again during subsequent missions. It already sounds like a setup for a good conspiracy theory, if no explanation had been found. But one was found, and it was even confirmed experimentally. It turned out that a cloud of contamination builds up around spacecraft. It forms when gas is emitted from external surfaces, small leaks occur, orientation thrusters operate, or waste is ejected into space. And the particles and ice crystals in the cloud create this effect. This could also affect the operation of some onboard instruments and somewhat blurring the vision of the cameras. This was confirmed by experiments on the Skylab space station and laboratory, which had special instruments that recorded external contamination. For example, quartz microbalances like these, which were placed on opposite sides of the station. Here's a graph showing the increasing contamination over time, and effects on optical instruments were also recorded. Now let's move 3 years ahead, to 1965. The next story is quite popular among ufologists. And this also relates to the Gemini 4 mission, during which the second ever spacewalk in history took place, after Alexei Leonov, and the first American spacewalk. This story is probably popular for another reason as well. One thing is some small lights, and quite another is an object of large size, possibly a very large one. At the beginning, as an example, I gave a fragment of a quote from James McDivitt, one of 2 crew members and the captain of the Gemini 4 mission. This quote isn't from communications during the mission itself, but from his later account, where he recalled how he saw the object. Here's a more complete quote. "I was flying with Ed White. He was sleeping at the time, so I don't have anybody to verify my story. We were drifting in space with the control engines shut down and all the instrumentation off, when suddenly an object appeared in the window. It had a very definite shape, a cylindrical object. It was white, it had a long arm that stuck out on the side. I don't know whether it was a very small object up close or a very large object long ways away. Considering that in space, most of the time, there's really nothing to compare the size of an object to, it can indeed be difficult to tell whether it's large or small. Overall, only McDivitt saw this object. But by then, cameras had already been invented, of course, and he did try to photograph the object. I'd be happy to show you these photos, but unfortunately there's nothing to show. After returning to Earth, McDivitt reviewed the photos, but he didn't see the object in them. And reflections and glares on the window glass made it difficult to photograph an object properly. One of the NASA staff even selected photos where the object was supposedly visible, but that too was just a sun glare. And James McDivitt himself said it wasn't the object. Almost immediately, a perfectly rational explanation appeared. The object, based on the description, closely resembled the stage of a Titan II booster. One of the objectives of the Gemini 4 mission was precisely to approach and fly alongside the second stage of the rocket. Adding to the mystery is the fact that at first McDivitt himself believed that it wasn't the rocket stage. He had previously spent 2 hours observing the stage as an exercise and thought he was fairly familiar with its appearance. However, a little later on the same flight, the second astronaut, Ed White, reported that he did see the booster flying nearby. In general, during the first sighting, McDivitt may have been mistaken, but even if he didn't initially recognize the object as a rocket stage, never doubted that it was some similar object and never thought it was something extraterrestrial. And the photographs that are presented as showing the object were rejected by McDivitt himself, the very person who saw it. And even so, people still consider this to be almost one of the best pieces of evidence for the existence of aliens near Earth. A somewhat similar story happened during the Gemini 7 mission, which also included training for rendezvous and formation flying. In the communications, Frank Borman mentioned certain fragments he saw near the rocket stage. Later, some retold this story as if the astronaut had seen a huge spherical object which is not mentioned in the actual communications. And sometimes it is accompanied by a photo like this one, which is fake. And in the end, these fragments turned out to be just ice crystals formed from the propellant of the Titan II. About another interesting example from those same years, I already made a whole video about the so-called Black Nights. about a strange dark object photographed by cosmonaut Sergei Krikalev during the Shuttle STS-88 mission. According to some, this object is an alien space satellite. This story is so wild that, as I said, I made an entire video dedicated to it. Well, as one of the arguments, people claim that during the Mercury 9 mission, Gordon Cooper saw this black knight. But this story is completely fabricated. Gordon Cooper himself denied it and even provided the mission transcripts as proof. But that's just a warm-up. The real fun begins on the moon, or around the moon. In May 1969, the Apollo 10 mission was sent to the moon. The crew members were Eugene Cernan, John Young, and Thomas Stafford. The mission was essentially a dress rehearsal for landing humans on the moon. As a part of it, almost all actions were carried out except for the actual descent to the surface. They completed about 30 orbits around the moon. The lunar module separated from the command module and approached to a distance of just over 14 kilometers or about 8.7 miles from the moon's surface, but it did not land. And with this mission is connected a strange story about alien music. A few years ago, the Science Channel aired a documentary called NASA's Unexplained Files. In it, to dramatic music, they told about this alien music that the Apollo 10 crew supposedly heard. They did hear sounds, and yes, they referred to them as music in their communications. Let's listen to a snippet of the communications again.
Boy, that sure is weird music. No. It's a whistling, you know, like an outer space type thing.
Eugene Cernan, who was piloting the lunar module, asked John Young, who was piloting the command module, whether he could hear the sound. First of all, that's incorrect. This is what Eugene Cernan just chose to describe what they heard. They described it as a whistling sound. Those who forced this story also emphasized that the astronauts heard it while on the far side of the moon, supposedly cut off from signals from Earth. They claimed that it couldn't have been Earth-based interference, but it wasn't interference from Earth. It was radio interference between the high-frequency radios of the lunar and command modules. Actually, radio tuning sounds like these would work pretty well for alien sound effects. In general, the astronauts did find the sound strange at first, but it has a perfectly ordinary explanation. After Apollo 10 came Apollo 11, and here again there is a story involving an unidentified object. Depending on where you read this story, it can be presented in different ways. The essence of it is that on the way to the moon, Apollo 11 was supposedly accompanied by some mysterious object, and that NASA allegedly tried to cover up this story. Here are a couple more actual real quotes. "We did watch a slow blinking light some substantial distance away from us." Neil Armstrong. "There was something out there, close enough to be observed," said Buzz Aldrin. It does sound strange and even unsettling, which is why this story is still retold in the context of aliens. But this mystery didn't remain one for long. The astronauts, together with the mission control, quickly figured out what the object was. And it turned out to be one of the 4 adapter panels between the S4B stage and the lunar module. After being jettisoned, at least one of the panels continued flying along the same trajectory as the lunar module. It appeared to flash because it was rotating and periodically reflecting sunlight. On subsequent missions, these panels also sometimes behaved in the same way. As for the idea that NASA was hiding something, it's more likely that this event was simply not considered very important, which isn't surprising. But what does really seem surprising? So this is that very same frame taken by the crew of Apollo 16. For decades, some people have considered it evidence that we are being visited by aliens. Visually, out of everything we've seen so far, this is probably the most impressive image. A clearly visible round object with a dome against the backdrop of the moon. For some reason, the object, again, looks a bit like the stereotypical flying saucer from old Hollywood movies. But in this case, it's not just because the image was faked by people guided by those stereotypes, as it often happens with similar images. Here is another version of this image of better quality, and this time it's the full frame rather than a cropped one. It even looks like the object is leaving some kind of trail, possibly exhaust? The frame is indeed real. In fact, there were several frames and it was a short video. Though I couldn't find the video itself, only individual frames. The footage was taken from the command module window just before the flight back to Earth. In general, neither the Apollo 16 crew nor NASA paid much attention to this object, for a long time at least, unlike ufologists. Still, they decided to investigate what it actually was. NASA specialists analyzed the frames, stabilized the video to account for camera movements, and combined individual frames to bring out more details. And they found the culprit. It wasn't aliens, but a lamp mounted on a long arm. Basically a stick intended to provide lighting during spacewalks. Here's the window from which the footage was taken, and here is the light source. And here's a comparison of the object in the infamous photo and the image of that light fixture. Quote-unquote trail behind the flying saucer isn't a trail at all. It's actually the rod on which the light is mounted. It happens. Even in photos from Moon's surface, people sometimes see something strange. But if these are not fakes and are genuine images, like this one, these strange objects don't even really need analysis as in the previous case. It's clear that it's just a regular lens flare. The frame is full of artifacts from sunlight reflections. Another example of a completely different nature is connected to the next mission, Apollo 17. Here's a transcript of the communications from this mission, and you can find an interesting line here. Harrison Schmitt says, "Hey, I just saw a flash on the lunar surface." It's easy to imagine how strange flashes of light on the surface of the dead moon could seem mysterious. What's glowing there? An alien base? But I think some of you already have an idea of what it might actually be. Phenomena like this have a common name, transient lunar phenomena, abbreviated as TLP. They are described as visible changes in areas of the moon's surface, lasting from fractions of a second to several hours. They come in various sizes and are mostly changes in brightness, although sometimes changes in color of the surface area are also reported. Not all of these phenomena are well documented or photographed, and many are known mostly from observers' accounts. But what is fairly well documented are flashes on the moon. Here's, for example, an animation showing one such flash. Here's another photo in which we can see a bright event on the unlit side of the moon. And here is a map of such events recorded over a short period by the Neolita project. Just like on Earth, small bodies regularly fall onto the moon, ranging from dust particles to larger meteoroids and asteroids. Only on the moon there is no atmosphere to burn up many of these fragments. And when they collide with the surface, energy is released, producing a flash of light. According to modern estimates based on observations from Earth, roughly one meteoroid the size of a ping-pong ball hits the moon every 12 minutes. Some of these events can last only fractions of a second, and they can be hard to capture in a single short exposure photo. So video recording works better here. Moreover, on the sunlit side of the moon, many of them are simply not visible. They're usually noticed less frequently, about one event every 2 hours. And during visual observations, it's very easy to miss them. And judging by everything, Harrison Schmitt saw exactly such an event. Moreover, Apollo 17's stay near the moon practically coincided with the peak of the Gemini meteor shower, when the frequency of such events can increase several times. I came across some ufology-related books, and they write a lot about these flashes. But even here, the explanation is fairly simple, though still interesting. Here's the situation so far. Astronauts have indeed seen things in space that surprised them at the moment of observation, and they didn't always identify them right away. And purely technically, among these observations, there are some things that could be called UFOs. They were flying and weren't immediately identified. But as we know, UFO doesn't mean aliens, and in the examples we've gone through, there's always a perfectly rational explanation, at least for now. And the logic that these accounts are strong evidence because astronauts themselves observed them is also a bit weak, especially since the astronauts themselves didn't think it was anything extraordinary. If there were an astronaut who outright said that they saw actual aliens, now that would be interesting. And oddly enough, there is such an astronaut. Well, the situation is a bit trickier, but no less strange. I'm talking about Edgar Mitchell. He flew to the moon as a part of the Apollo 14 mission and was the 6th person in history to walk on the lunar surface. But on top of that, he was a ufologist. He believed that aliens are visiting us and that NASA and the government know about it and are covering it all up. What's interesting is that he himself didn't see anything strange in space like the things I talked about earlier. And he said he had no evidence of the existence of aliens here with us. But supposedly he had heard about it in conversations with people who were in the know. That sounds familiar somehow. I mean, it would be one thing if he had at least seen something, or even better, filmed it, but as it is. So really, it's probably not surprising that in any group of people there will be someone inclined to believe in things like that. And an interesting nuance here is that he grew up near Roswell. The atmosphere and culture that developed around that place may have influenced his views. Besides aliens, he also believed in various forms of esotericism and extrasensory phenomena. And here's the next thing, which is downright amusing. During an Apollo mission, he conducted an unauthorized experiment. What kind? Extrasensory transmission of thoughts. Supposedly, he was sending messages to his friends, participants in the experiment, using the power of his mind. Sounds amazing. And later, he even founded the so-called Institute of Noetic Sciences, which deals with various forms of parapsychology. In short, on the one hand, when you hear that a real astronaut who has been to the moon claims that aliens exist, you think, wow. Then when you find out that he didn't actually see anything himself, the excitement fades, especially when it turns out he has no evidence. And then you learn he's just an enthusiast of UFOs, extrasensory stuff and all that. Unfortunately. Now let's talk about some very recent cases of this kind. Sometimes the situation is a bit different. We learn about some strange objects not directly from people who have been to space, but from someone reviewing recordings of space missions and spotting potentially suspicious objects. They cut out these fragments and post them on the internet without much context. Take a look at this video clip. What do you think it is? In the video description, the object is called a UFO. Honestly, from this fragment alone, without context, you can't understand anything. What it is or where it is, just some indistinguishable thing on a black background, but the recording is real, and it really is from space. It was taken during the Shuttle STS-77 mission. Astronaut Mario Ronco, who was part of this mission, commented that the footage is theirs, and that the object in the footage is the PANS-STU satellite, which they were deploying into orbit during that mission. And they filmed it for quite a while. And how do you like this footage? Some object is flying in space outside the spacecraft and then suddenly shoots off somewhere. This is footage from the Shuttle STS-80 mission, but here too, the explanation is mundane. These are ice crystals which, as we found out, can form near the spacecraft. And it suddenly shoots away because at some point it gets caught in the thruster's exhaust. In 2020, cosmonaut Ivan Wagner published this video taken from the ISS, and he captioned it saying that besides the auroras, something else can be seen here as well. Did you manage to catch that? Here are those objects. He then added, what do you think this is? Meteors? Satellites? Or? In reality, everything here was moving more slowly. This video is sped up. A few objects flying in formation in a row. Do you have any ideas what this might be? Most likely this is nothing other than Starlinks. I've seen them in the sky multiple times. There are other examples as well, and in some cases we only know about them from accounts and we don't have any photos or videos. But today I haven't mentioned one more important detail. Yes, in most cases all these objects are explained by natural phenomena or by other satellites or spacecraft and their fragments or debris. But astronauts can also see things that aren't actually there. And I'm not talking about hallucinations. although that can't be completely ruled out either. What I'm talking about now is the cosmic ray visual phenomena. Recently I made a video about space radiation. Well, here's another one of its effects that we haven't talked about yet. Ever since the Apollo missions, astronauts have reported seeing flashes in space, sometimes even with their eyes closed. According to descriptions, they come in various shapes: dots, spots, lines, and clouds. They are mostly white, though sometimes they have tingles of color. It is now believed that cosmic rays, high-energy particles, are responsible for this, although some details of the process are still uncertain. The effect likely occurs when cosmic particles pass through the eyes and possibly even interact directly with parts of the brain responsible for vision. When astronauts enter regions where cosmic radiation is more intense, the frequency of these flashes also increases. The particles vary in type and energy, so the effects can differ as well. There's a chance that at least some of the events described as unidentified objects, which weren't captured on camera, can be explained by such particles. So overall, it's easy to brush off stories about people in space seeing UFOs. Yet such events really have happened and still happen today. But we don't know of any cases that are truly anomalous and can't be explained. And everything that sounds promising to those who want to believe that aliens are visiting us is usually either completely made up or greatly exaggerated, or taken out of context. Every example I've talked about today could be presented with dramatic music and voice with some details omitted, and it would look completely different. And that's often exactly what's done on the internet and in the media. At the same time, interesting events and phenomena really do happen in space, like the flashes on the moon, for example, or the effects of cosmic rays. Meanwhile, here we are, floating alone on our planet, and so far, no one's really coming to visit us, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately.